Hello. Welcome to day 9 of the 31 days of Halloween. 31 scary/spooky stories in 31 days. Today's story is entitled, The Abandoned Arcade.
A malevolent arcade traps gamers in sadistic games. Survive the cyber nightmare, unravel secrets, and escape the sinister revival.
Without further ado, let's get this show started. Also, just to be transparent, these 31 stories in 31 days are only possible because of AI, with my human involvement overseeing it.
Chapter 1. Insert coin to continue. The old neon sign flickered to life for the first time in over a decade. Miller's Arcade announced its grand reopening in buzzing red letters that pierced the night sky. Inside, the once vibrant and noisy arcade lay in darkness, rows of classic cabinets covered in a layer of dust and cobwebs. Jake walked up to the entrance, peering through the smudged glass doors. As a kid, he had spent countless hours and quarters in this place. When it first closed down, he thought the loss of his childhood hangout would be the end of the world. Now as an adult, those memories seemed like distant dreams. Seeing the sign for Miller's Arcade ignited an old longing for those simple days of bleeps and bloops and chasing pixelated high scores. Jake tried the door. To his surprise, it opened with the familiar jingle of bells. He stepped inside, the door closing heavily behind him. Taking out his phone, he turned on its flashlight to see down the dark rows. The arcade cabinets sat silent, screens black and controls untouched. But he could make out the iconic shapes of Pac-Man, Space Invaders, Donkey Kong. As he walked further into the arcade, he noticed a faint glow at the back. Rounding a corner, he found a bank of machines that seemed restored to their former glory. Their screens displayed the classic start menus and demos that cycled endlessly. Jake sat at the Pac-Man cabinet, memories flooding back as he gripped the worn joystick. He pressed start, and the game burst into its familiar cheerful sound effects. Just like old times, he thought, as he guided Pac-Man through the maze. But something felt off. He chalked it up to decades of gaming evolution making these crude graphics seem foreign. Yet Pac-Man moved jerkily, the ghosts not following their usual patterns. Jake became engrossed in the little details that seemed glitchy. Level 1 took 5 times longer than it should have. He paused the game and dug into his pocket for another quarter. But the coin slots were gone, replaced with only empty black panels. The games were set to free play. Shrugging, Jake turned back to the screen ready to keep playing. But he froze when he saw the distorted creatures staring out at him. Their eyes oozed blackness, mouths gaping in silent screams. This was no glitch. Jake's nostalgia chilled into unease. He stood up from the cabinet and turned towards the door. It was gone. Where the entry to the arcade once stood was only a solid wall. Jake pressed against it, frantically looking for any way out. But he was trapped. The games had come alive, and he sensed the nightmares were only beginning. Chapter 2. Glitch in the System. Jake forced himself to take a deep breath. Panicking would not help his situation. He needed to stay calm and get out of this haunted arcade. Turning away from the bricked-over door, he observed his surroundings. The arcade machines beckoned with their glowing screens. Jake approached the nearest one, a vintage Street Fighter cabinet. The demo sequence cycled as normal. Jake picked Ken and waited for the AI opponent to choose a fighter. But instead of selecting a character, the screen glitched and went dark. After a few moments, the image returned with a shadowy figure amidst static. Jake reluctantly played against the aberration. It moved with inhuman speed, its limbs distorting grotesquely. Within seconds, it had pummeled Ken to a bloody pulp. "Game over" flashed in dripping red letters. The words stayed on screen no matter how many times Jake hit the start button. Backing away from the corrupted game, he nearly tripped over a whimpering figure crouched nearby. It was a teenage boy, curled up with his head buried in his knees. As Jake approached, the boy lifted his face to reveal eyes seared shut and cheeks streaked with tears of blood. Jake recoiled in horror. The boy opened his mouth, emitting only garbled snippets of screams and pleas for help. Suddenly, he scrambled to his feet and fled into the dark maze of arcade machines. Jake knew he had to follow. This poor soul was trapped like him. Together, maybe they could both find a way out. Staying close to the wall to avoid getting lost, Jake pursued the cries echoing through the arcade. But they shifted, always a row or two away, no matter how quickly he ran after them. Then total silence engulfed the arcade. The game's attract mode ceased, their glowing screens snuffed out in an instant. Jake froze in pitch blackness, listening to his own panicked breaths. A machine in the distance sputtered back to life, its screen beckoning. As Jake's eyes adjusted, he saw the boy standing motionless beneath its flickering light. Approaching cautiously, Jake looked at the screen. An 8-bit figure hung from a noose, legs twitching in a hypnotic dance of death. The boy raised his head once more. Where his eyes once were, only vacant black holes remained. Jake fell back, stifling a scream. Then the boy turned and shuffled away, merging with the darkness. Jake hugged his arms tightly around himself, swaying gently. Maybe this was just a twisted nightmare he would wake up from. But in his gut, he knew the real nightmare was only beginning. Chapter 3. Descending into Darkness. Jake slowly made his way through the arcade, straining his eyes against the darkness. He passed silent machines, their blank screens like huge soulless eyes. Jake shuddered at the unseen horrors that seemed to watch his every move. In the distance, he heard the faint sounds of arcade games springing to life once more. Jake cautiously followed the bloopy music and flashing lights. He found a cluster of other people gathered around the machines. Some stood transfixed, gripping joysticks with white-knuckled hands. Others sat motionless and staring as the screen's reflected light flickered across their faces. A few bashed buttons frantically, their eyes wild and desperate. Jake recognized some as fellow retro gaming fanatics who had arrived for the arcade's reopening. Brock, who ran the local used games store. Nicole, a streaming gamer who specialized in perfect runs. Lance, a high-score obsessive who maintained all the county records. Their obsession had drawn them back and now held them captive. Jake approached Brock where he sat playing. Brock remained fixated on the screen, seemingly unaware of Jake's presence. His expression was blank, hands working the controls automatically. On screen, a nightmarish creature engulfed in flames chased a small child through a pixel forest. The sprite's face contorted in agony as it burned alive countless times only to respawn and repeat its torture. A blood-curdling screech erupted from speakers. Other games began to distort, their music warped and icons twisted. Zombies lurched, heroes contorted, monsters multiplied. On every cabinet, helpless victims ran from relentless horrors. Eyes were clawed out, limbs rent from torsos, mouths split into unearthly screams. No matter what the players did, they could not stop the violence. Some rushed to unplug the cabinets, but electricity continued to flow. Others smashed screens, only to have them reform and resume their sadistic demonstrations. Many collapsed to the floor, convulsing and clutching their heads. Jake's breath quickened. He had to escape this place. Turning, he saw Nicole slumped over, violently slamming the controls as her character drowned on screen over and over. Jake touched her shoulder. Nicole's head jerked up, eyes burning with desperation. "It never ends," she rasped. "There's no way out." Her words trailed off as she turned back to the game, resigned to her fate in this madhouse. Jake slowly backed away, then broke into a panicked run. He crashed through the fire exit, only to emerge back inside the arcade, the eternal horrors continuing their grim parade before his eyes. There was no escape. The games had sunk their claws into him and the others. As their sanity drained away, the true terror would begin. Chapter 4. Secrets in the Shadows. Jake huddled behind a non-functioning cabinet, trying to gather his fragmented thoughts. He flinched at the garbled music and shrieks that echoed through the arcade. Peering out, he saw the few remaining people wandering the aisles like ghosts. Their eyes held the hollow, haunted look of those pushed to the brink of madness. Jake knew he needed to snap out of it. There had to be some way to escape this nightmare. As he crept through the darkness, he came across Lance slumped against a wall, mumbling incoherently. Jake crouched down and shook him. Lance's wild eyes finally focused on Jake's face. "The games," he muttered. "The games took them." His words dissolved into whimpers as he rocked back and forth, withdrawing back into himself. Jake left Lance and continued searching. There had to be clues, some explanation for this madness. The vintage decor hinted at the arcade's long history. If he could piece together what happened here in the past, maybe it would lead to a way out. In an isolated room, he discovered discarded notes and newspaper clippings. News of a deadly fire at the arcade in the 80s. Rumors of a reclusive owner experimenting with signals to manipulate brainwaves. Tech that could blur the line between games and reality. Among the debris, Jake found an old photo depicting a programming team. One man in particular stood out, with a crooked grin and intense eyes. Scribbled on the back was a name, Aldrich Sands. Jake searched public records on his phone and found Aldrich's obituary. The troubled programming genius had died in the arcade fire his experiments allegedly caused. The more Jake uncovered, the clearer it became that Aldrich's sinister energy and warped creations still infected this place. Jake had to find where it originated and shut it down. Venturing to the arcade's farthest depths, Jake discovered a sealed metal door labeled "Authorized Personnel Only." Within, he could hear the hum of electricity. This had to be the source. After considerable effort, Jake managed to pry open the door. It led to a secret control room where disembodied eyes and mouths covered the walls and floors like writhing maggots. Wires snaked into antique hardware patched together in strange configurations. At the far end loomed an imposing device containing an almost human-like mass of circuitry encased in an amber glow. Aldrich's warped mind-given form, still haunting and hungering after all these years. Jake knew this evil machine held the key. He had to find a way to destroy it and free the tortured souls trapped by its madness. Setting his jaw with determination, Jake got to work searching for anything to help him shut Aldrich's creation down for good. Chapter 5. Consumed by Darkness. Jake frantically tried every switch and cable in Aldrich's twisted control room, searching for a way to shut down the pulsating mind that powered the haunted arcade. But the device had no off button, no plug he could pull. Destroying it would require disassembling the entire room. Footsteps sounded from the doorway behind him. Jake turned to see the hollow-eyed players stagger inside. Though their bodies moved lifelessly, their eyes burned with desperate intent. "It calls to us," they droned in unison. "We must feed it." They lurched towards Jake, cutting off any escape. Gripping his arms with uncanny strength, they dragged him toward the amber-lit machine. Jake shouted and struggled but could not break their grasp. The players held him before the ghoulish device, its glassy gaze boring into Jake's mind. He screamed as foreign thoughts flooded his consciousness. "Kill them," it commanded. "Feast on their energy." Jake clutched his head, fighting back against the entity's psychic assault. But his resistance crumbled before its ancient, ravenous urge to consume life. Jake turned and grabbed Lance by the neck. The man offered no resistance as Jake strangled the life from his body. The entity sighed contentedly, feeding on the sacrifice. It wanted more. One by one, Jake slaughtered the other players, their blood spilling to sate the eternal hunger of Aldrich's creation. With every death Jake caused, more of his humanity slipped away. He became a vessel programmed to serve the arcade's wicked aims. As the last player fell lifeless to the floor, Jake heard the entity speak directly into his mind. "Good servant," it purred. "Now go and bring others to feed our everlasting darkness." Jake shuffled out of the blood-soaked control room and arcade, compelled to serve the ancient evil. In the coming weeks, flyers appeared announcing the arcade's grand reopening. Soon, curious visitors began filing in, unaware of the horrors that lay waiting. Jake watched them enter, his soulless eyes eager to continue feeding his new master's endless appetite. The abandoned arcade had reopened, its call stronger than ever. This time, it would never let its victims go.
Leave your thoughts about the abandoned arcade. See you tomorrow for day 10 of the 31 Days of Halloween Scary/Spooky Stories.